Hello there. I thought I'd add another update, a little response to some back and forth comment that have been going on Reddit regarding my issues with my Falcon. My battery box is sheared off due to the structural support down here not being great. If you made it this far, you know that about that. Someone made the comment that the real reason this happened wasn't an error on the part of Begode. It was user error because I had removed the trolley handle and kickstand from my wheel, and that those were important structural items that helped hold the whole thing rigid together, and therefore I'd created an unstable wheel and created shearing forces here. And that all I need to do is replace my trolley handle and my kickstand, and if no one else does that, doesn't take it off, they won't have that problem. Now here's the problem with that. Here's the kickstand, here's the trolley handle. This kickstand actually broke the very first time I got up any speed on my wheel. I spun out. I hadn't even really learned how to ride yet. I was probably going 10 miles an hour and hit the concrete here, or the pavement out in front of my house. And this got floppy. These bolts pulled out and these bolts sheared completely off. So now this three-piece kickstand, which supposedly adds some structure, is no longer structure because it's two separate pieces. I took it off at that point. There's no point in having it there. It does appear that whoever made this did intend for it to provide some structural rigidity, because they used a pretty beefy piece of aluminum for each of these individual pieces. The problem is, and it seems to be a design language throughout the whole thing, they axially loaded these cheap M5 bolts as the only connection between the parts. Okay, so realistically, if you want this to provide any kind of structure, the two parts need to integrate in some way. They need to have some kind of overlap. There needs to be some sort of angle in there, not a flat surface against a flat surface, with the only connection being literally those bolts being loaded axially, which means that when force goes in this direction, as you can imagine, this entire rigid piece of aluminum becomes a pry bar, with this being the short lever and this being the long lever, providing force against these tiny little bolts that are going to shear. That's just what happened. Even if we had quality bolts, it would just pull out of the metal. There's just no doubt about it. You could probably do it with your hand if you just pulled it apart when you took it off. Additionally, this is not actually the direction that these need support in. It's actually these two boxes moving independently this direction. And as you can imagine, given that the plates are all in parallel to that, it's not going to provide really any meaningful resistance towards movement in that direction. What about the trolley handle? So the trolley handle, also, this is only attached on the edges of the battery box by this little lip, which bends quite easily, and these tiny little bits of metal. Let's see if I can get the lighting correct so you can see. These tiny little bits of metal on the edge here. As you can see, these bolts can pull out. In fact, one of mine did. I think it might have been on one of the battery boxes I sent back, or it might be in the corner here somewhere. But as you can see, it's a tiny little bit of metal there that's holding that. Any stress on this in this direction literally stretches this hole out and makes it larger, because there's just not enough metal there. And even if there was, that isn't providing any support in the direction it needs to. So going to the trolley handle. So the trolley handle, they kind of improved a little bit by adding this piece. So it still has nothing preventing it from bending this direction, but at least it can't bend the opposite direction. So that's support in one direction. And then you think about if the two of them were anchored together across, then overall that would be structural support. But the only thing holding the two sides together is the trolley handle itself. And if you notice this trolley handle, even though this is a big beefy piece here and this is a beefy piece here, they're only held together by this single piece of round aluminum stock, again with axially loaded bolts mating two flat surfaces against each other. The handle part itself doesn't provide anything because it's not rigidly connected. There's movement there. There's movement in every single direction at this, where the washers are. And as a result, even if you crank these down as tight as you can, which you can't really do for very long because they'll strip out, this can still move in this direction. I don't know if you can see that. These pieces move independently in every direction. So therefore, these two sides are not anchored together by the trolley handle in any meaningful way, providing any meaningful support. Now, it is true that once this sheared, instead of dropping all the way down and pulling the wires out, it may have dropped down and been held a few inches higher by this part sagging and holding it. Sure, that's great. It doesn't prevent the shearing from happening. It just, maybe, I guess you could call that a little safety margin of it not falling all the way off and being potentially as much of a catastrophic failure. If you happen to be going at speed, you might survive the crash better. But the crash is still going to happen, and the shearing is still going to happen. It's not going to make any difference whatsoever. If they wanted to provide some structure between these two boxes, other than these axial loaded bolts, what they could have done is put a bar entirely across from these holes to these holes. You could put one long bolt through it, perhaps with a little piece of metal like this to make it rigid. And that would actually provide you some structure by having it be a straight line, preferably with a plate that fits snug, right? So that it's up against this rigid piece on more than just a bolt, so that it has some resistance against torsion to the sides, okay? But it doesn't. Nothing about that provides any meaningful structural support. Also, as long as I'm here, I want to say one more time, I want to shout out to eWheels. I now have even more experience with them. They sent me a new battery box very quickly. They did a great job. They gave me a free label to send the broken one back. They asked me if I wanted to replace both, just in case, of this one. I said, nah, don't bother. I think the other side will still hold. I'll just put better bolts into it. Be careful with it. They also sent me new hanger plates while they were at it, because my hanger plate right here had stripped out a little bit at the bottom, and now that's better. Even though they can't fix the fact that there's a bit of a design flaw there. The holes just from the factory aren't drilled deep enough. You can see those bolts don't go in all the way. That's just Begode. There's nothing you can do about that. But they were very good at communicating with me, kept me updated every step of the process. Were very, very easy to work with, much better than you could expect from most merchants. I'm having some issue with my other wheel that I got from Alien Rides, and it's not terrible, but it's clearly not the same level of service or attentiveness. All right, thank you.